For the past decade or more, we've lived in an era of massive cultural decline. We've seen great technological advances in the new millennium, in the 2000s and into the 2010s, and now in the 2020s. We've seen the type of technological advancements that only could have been dreamed of. And it was all on pace. I mean, since roughly the 40s or 50s, we saw all sorts of consumer electronics come onto the market, and they just kept evolving into what we have now at a rapid pace. Computer technology went from taking up a whole room to fitting into the palm of your hand. It's astounding stuff, but the decline has been unbelievable as well. It's not to say that the 20th century, as so many people paint the late 20th century as being somewhat of a golden age. There were certainly some brilliant and beautiful things about the late 20th century. It was certainly better than a lot of the earliest 20th century, but the 20th century as a whole was called the bloodiest in human history. There were two world wars, multiple civil wars and conflicts, all sorts of economic disparity, Great Depression, so on and so forth. And I think what's happened is, towards the end, in the 90s, there was economic prosperity, and then that carried over into the early 2000s. And then 9/11 happened, and it reminded people that blood is still being shed. Violence is still a thing. Human nature is still wicked and crooked and evil. And that you can't just rest on when things are good. You have to look at the good and the bad. The reality of the world is that people do evil things. People are, as a Christian, the belief is that we are all inherently sinful. And that sin nature doesn't go away just because times are good. Human nature doesn't change. It stays the same. Ever since Adam and Eve, the fall in the garden, that's a curse over mankind, and it's a curse we've been living out for thousands of years. Now, whether or not you believe all that, that's entirely up to you. I believe it as a Christ follower, and I'm seeing the fruition of that in my own life. But I think what is happening is, for the first time, my generation is seeing what people in the early 20th century were seeing. We're entering into a new dark age, an age of division, an age of difficulty, of strife, financial difficulty. We've got banks in a sea of uncertainty. We've got inflation like we've never seen in this century, but we did see in the 20th century. It's getting very close to where it was in the 70s. And for people who lived in the 70s, it was bad, but they did survive it. So there's still hope for that, but it's something we've never had to deal with. People are struggling just to pay bills. Their jobs aren't producing the wealth that they need to survive. It used to be there was a time in America, even when things were difficult, there was enough prosperity to where people could work less and afford more. Companies could afford to pay their employees more. Now companies can't afford to do that. But the entire outlook of business was different then. Whereas now, the entire outlook of business is to the point where they can't really afford to pay their employees. Some people will say, well, it's just greed. They just choose not to pay their employees. But that's rarely the case. A lot of times it's they can't afford it. And you can thank the government with regulation and taxation for that. It has nothing to do with capitalism. You hear young people who are naively socialist saying capitalism this, capitalism that. Capitalism brought people out. It's corporatism and sheer corporate mismanagement and greed that causes all of this. And the government regulation only makes it worse, even though it seeks to make it better. The free market isn't operating as a free market should, because the government won't get out of the dang way. But no matter what way you choose to look at it, life is getting worse. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. There's not a lot of hope for the future for a lot of people. Myself, going into 2023, as I'm about to turn 31, last year I just said goodbye to my 20s, which was a tumultuous and very mixed decade of my life. It's hard to believe it's already been a decade of my 20s. It's hard to believe they came and went. But I'm entering into the first year of a new decade. And I don't have a lot of hope for the way things are going, and for the first time in my life, I'm truly anxious about things. For the first time in my life, I'm truly discouraged for the future. I'm thinking about death more often than I should, about losing people who are close to me. I wasn't worried about that before, but I had a couple of losses in the family that were very close and sudden. And so it started to be on my mind. In January, I had for the first time in my life what I figure was a panic attack, where I just started dwelling on these things, and it started causing me to be uber anxious in a way I've never felt before. Something that was truly unnerving and unsettling. And so at the end of the day, even though I felt that way, and I do feel better now for anybody who's wondering, I don't want people to worry. I have gotten through that. I'm still very uneasy about life. I'm still more of a nervous person than I was in the past. I don't know if it's something to do with age or what's going on with the state of the world and the way that I dwell on the state of the world. I don't know what caused it, but I am okay. I am stable. But that was scary dealing with that back in January. But it's all got me to think. This cultural decline has been happening for the past decade and a half. The political division is like nothing I've ever seen before. There's been nasty political division in America before. I mean, there was an entire civil war. And even after that, when things were supposedly healed and patched up, it didn't go as well as it should have. There was the civil rights movement and how nasty that was. But I look at that and I see how people overcame that by God's grace, one, and number two, they overcame that by being peaceful, by being good-hearted. They didn't do it with violence or with vitriol. The people who were violent and vitriol were the ones who propelled a movement to something better. The civil rights movement could have descended into both sides being terribly violent in another civil war, but it didn't. I'm sure there are many people who opined about how this could be a second civil war, but it wasn't. I think it's important that we learn from that portion of history and we don't engage in left versus right violence. And that we don't constantly get engaged in name calling and being mean spirited. I know it's easier said than done, especially for specific sides, but we can't afford a second civil war in this nation. It won't end like the first. It won't be like the first. The first was bad enough. We can't afford to do that again. We've got so many problems. We've got the economy falling to pieces. I look around me and I see retail closing left and right because everybody wants to embrace the internet. But then there's problems with internet retail. But losing in-person experiences is causing a lot of people to lose critical skills. I look at the education system. It's worse than it's ever been. You look at inner city schools, kids aren't even learning to read and write. They're illiterate. We need school choice back. We need people to be able to actually get their children to where they can get an education and learn the essentials and be motivated to get an education. And if they've got disabilities, be able to learn how they're able to learn. But they're not doing that. Kids are just being thrown into a government system as they have been for years. That the government shouldn't even be in education. That's part of the problem, is that we're throwing kids into a government prison basically and expecting the kids to A, get along, B, listen to the teachers, and C, get an education. And none of that is happening. Kids are being forced into this instead of being given choice. They need to be given choice. They need opportunities to be able to learn with better teachers and to learn the truth, to learn critical thinking skills to survive. I know it's a push button world, and that's part of the problem. So people just expect that everything is available at the push of a button, and most things are. But people don't have the critical skills necessary to survive anymore. They're losing that. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history. And now, because of all the different agendas, history is being taught through specific lenses. It's not being presented factually. It's being presented but with a slant because people have such vitriol against the evil that they've seen in the past through history. Look, nobody is saying that slavery was good or that the civil rights movement, that people deserved to be black people deserve to be treated the way that they were. Nobody is saying that. I've never met anybody who said that or who believes that. But you've got a generation who sees these things. They think, A, we haven't changed as a nation, which we clearly have, and B, they need to be fighting it where it isn't. So they're just accusing random people of racism, of sexism, and of any sort of ism And that's how they're educating kids, when kids need to hear that, no, these things can be bad, but not all of history is terrible. We shouldn't lament people for what they did in the past. We're a new generation. We've done things differently. We've made progress in this country, and we're about to lose that progress to a class of people who have victimized themselves based largely on transgressions of the past that they insist are still perpetual today. Insist, and worse, they insist that they're systemic today when they're not. There's no systemic racism in the United States anymore. Case by case racism, there will always be that. There always has been that. But there's no longer systemic racism, and you won't get rid of that. Number one, because of sin nature, mankind's nature being inherently corrupt. But number two, as long as there's differences, people will always argue and fight over differences. We can't accept differences truly. We've never been able to. We've gotten better at tolerating differences, but accepting differences is not a universal thing. It never really has been. People still persecute each other for whatever reason. And you don't solve that by being militant and nasty and engaging in what the radical left engages in. That's not how you fix society. You don't fix society by treating people with contempt and perceiving them to treat you with contempt when they haven't. You fix society by being a better individual yourself, giving grace to people, peacefully disagreeing with people, being a peacemaker, not a war starter. But our culture is filled with people who are trying to start wars, and then people who are responding in kind because they're tired of people trying to start wars and conflicts. And so it's just rapidly declining. And I'm not here to blackpill anybody. There's a lot of bad news out there. You hear bad news every day, and I think that's part of our problem. We need to step away from the bad news. We know inflation's going on. We know people are struggling to pay bills and struggling to bring in the income they need to. We know people are struggling in all various areas of life. But there's a couple of things we need to do. Number one, we need to pull away from our internet culture a little bit. We need to know when to disengage, when it's affecting our psyche to pull away. Some of us need to just delete some of our social media. I deleted Twitter years ago because I made great friends on Twitter, but the experience devolved because it was so much interaction, and there were so many people who were just looking to tear down everything I had to say. Everything, for no reason. It's just you come in and you feel an impulse to just argue with people about something. And I used to feel it when I was young too, and then I realized it and I was horrified at myself. I'm sitting here arguing with somebody I don't know over something that in the grand scheme of things may not matter, or is not going to change anybody's mind through argumentation on the internet. And so I pulled away from that. I remember getting viscerally mad at people over Twitter for no reason. I would get mad at people over stupid arguments that I didn't even know. I would end up going on blocking sprees. I would have to calm myself down because I was getting so angry that people were so ignorant, I felt, or so whatever. And I can only imagine that that's how a lot of people operate today on Twitter. But I left that because I realized I was treating people with contempt and becoming the type of person I don't want to be. More people need to do that. They need to step away and say, I don't want to be that person who engages in all sorts of argumentation and vitriolic anger. People don't agree with me. I'm a Christian. More people disagree with me than agree with me. But I have to come to peace with that. And the Bible says I have to learn to love these people. Not love their sin, but love them enough to pray that they walk away from their sin and repent. And not just be vitriolic towards them. That's what I've got to do. Look, our culture is only going to get better when people stop trying to tear each other down. Even if you've got a good cause, you have to approach opposition in a way that is healthy, not in a way that creates more conflict. It's hard to do. Sometimes you got to just walk away from a conflict. You got to understand, as I've gotten older and matured, you got to understand people are going to argue for their point of view if they've got an emotional attachment to it. And that's fine. Sometimes you just got to walk away. Sometimes you got to not engage. More often than not, I choose not to engage somebody. But where it's escalating now is it's going into the realm of law. It's not just internet arguments anymore. People are taking their internet arguments and making arguments for this should be legal, this should be illegal. We've got arguments about what to do with children and what should be legal and illegal to do for children. And that's where it's getting really heated. First of all, you don't have a right to legislate over how somebody else parents their child. You just don't. And you don't get to legislate making choices for somebody else's child. Plain and simple. But that's one of the more current arguments, is people trying to legislate over making decisions for somebody else's child for them. And that's not good. That's not good at all. That's not a healthy society. That creates more division than ever, because now you're stepping way over the line. You're stepping way out of your boundary. Picture you're in a suburban neighborhood and there's a fence separating you from your neighbor. Think of Home Improvement and Wilson. Imagine if Wilson jumped over that fence and beat the crap out of Tim Allen. He's stepping over the line. He'd go to jail. But he didn't do that. He was a peaceful neighbor, even when he disagreed with Tim. And he gave what good advice he could. We're losing that sense of being neighborly in our culture, and we need to gain it back. We need to do little things to be neighborly and to be generous and to not engage in political argumentation. We need to do more in real life and less online. Because online, it's easy to just blurt out whatever you want, right? Online, it's easy to just say, well, I believe this is the best way to do it, and here's why these people are wrong. I've engaged in that. And then you get pushback from the people who you're accusing of being wrong, which is a natural response. But then it devolves into just this stupidly emotional slap fight. And in some cases, it gets worse. It involves doxing and actual violence. We need to learn when to step away. Doesn't mean don't speak the truth. It doesn't mean don't take a stand for what is true. Absolutely do that. If you believe something to be true, then absolutely take a stand for it. But know when to disengage with people. Know when to log off or hit a block button or do whatever it is you need to do. I'd say stay off of Twitter, because there's a lot of mentally unwell people on Twitter who just want to argue. That's all they want to do. That's what I was seeing at the end, is that's all they want to do is argue, 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 argue. I was seeing that on other platforms, but I just disengaged with those people at that point. It wasn't worth the emotional triggering response, that sort of fight or flight response. It wasn't worth that, where you're physically shaking because you're so upset. I got to that point, and I'm sure plenty of reasonable people have gotten to that point. Because you just can't believe that the other person has the position that they do. And that's largely how, when people talk about the radical left, that's largely how they operate. They get so, it's a physical feeling that they get of just pure rage and upset anger. And people on the other side do too. But the left tends to act on it and get wild and crazy and destructive because they don't know how to hold it back. They're not mature enough to hold it back, a lot of them. I had to learn to disengage and hold it back. And I'm still tempted to be that way today with some people. And every time it comes, I have to go, no, I'm not going to do this. This isn't worth it. This person isn't where I don't know who they are. I don't know what they're going through in their life. I don't know if they just believe this temporarily. I don't know if they're going to believe this for the rest of their life. But I need to just disengage with it, because I'm not contributing to creating a better culture and slowing this decline. But I do know that this decline is destroying people's psyches. It's destroying how people approach their day-to-day life. People don't want to continue on their day-to-day life. They want to just give up on life entirely. And that has its own disastrous results. People are just thinking life isn't worth it. I don't want to get married because it's just going to be a big battle. The institution of marriage has been all but destroyed in America. People, both genders, have gone, well, you know what, it's not really worth the trouble, because the way that the divorce is handled, you know, if I marry a woman and it doesn't go right, then she can take everything from me. And that's where you got MGTOW. And then you got feminism saying men are only abusive and they only hold us down. So you've got two sides and they're splitting, and then the nuclear family ends up destroyed, and then kids suffer. And that's where we're at today, is kids are suffering because a lot of them aren't being raised by families who love each other. And that was a problem in the past too. That's not a new problem. That's a problem that started, oh geez, by and large, it could have started at any point in American history, but it really ramped up in, I would say, the 80s and 90s, like most things. I remember growing up in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were a lot of divorced families, families on the brink of divorce, because the wrong people just ended up getting married. They didn't want to do life together. They just had stars in their eyes and wanted to have sex with each other. And they thought, oh yeah, sure, we love each other enough to make a family work. They didn't critically think about the ramifications of long-term life and that you have to weather the storm for the sake of each other and for the sake of the kids. But there was a time where it worked. My aunt and uncle, God bless them, may they both rest in peace. They stayed together for several years of their life. They both died in their I think in their 80s. One had a stroke, the other had cancer. My uncle had a stroke that left him debilitated. He needed to go to a nursing home, and he died several months, or even I think a year later. I think it was just a couple of months later in a nursing home. And then my aunt had a battle with cancer that she had initially won, but it came back, and she just decided at this point, I've lost my husband. I've got this house that I'm living in. I'm older. I'm ready to just go and be with the Lord. And so her family honored that, and they just eased her into that, which was a beautiful thing. That was the death I felt the most comfortable with. It was the sudden deaths that happened in my family throughout the past uh, couple of years, and some friends, that really disturbed me. But point being, both my aunt and uncle, they lived out till death do us part. There's too many people who don't live out till death do us part. And I know some people are going to say, yeah, well, it's easy to say in the beginning, and then you get into the minutia of life, but that's the whole point. Marriages struggle, but you fight to keep them together, not just for the sake of the kids, but because you need to have meant it when you said, I want to be with you for the rest of my life. And people don't embrace that anymore. Only a handful of people do, and it's beautiful to see. You see these young kids who are awestruck at old couples, and they say, we've been together 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And these kids are just like, wow, real love does exist. And I'm like, exactly. But that's because you have to fight for it, no matter what. You have to be committed to the right person. And sometimes that means a longer dating period for some people, and really getting to know each other on a deeper level and tackling issues. And it takes a level of humility and understanding of the other person. But we don't live in a culture that fosters humility. We live in a culture that fosters pride. And that's what's contributing to our cultural decline, is the embrace of pride and selfish, narcissistic ambition. And social media is feeding into that as well. There's all sorts of problems. But I do believe by God's grace there's a solution. There's multiple solutions. As long as there are people who have good morals and traditional values that they're willing to pass on to their kids and live out themselves, I think that there will always be a good portion of society that people will flock to. A lot of this new progressive philosophy doesn't lead to anything meaningful. And when those people fail, they'll end up turning back to tradition because they will see the fruits of what it bore. Eventually they wrote it off because they feel like they've only been abused by tradition. But then they'll realize that tradition really isn't bad. It's just a case by case of basis of individuals and their own choices that make things bad. It's not the traditions themselves. Marriage is not a bad institution. Nuclear family is not a bad institution. The church is not a bad institution. It's people who are sinful that create bad experiences. But there are people who are seeking God and who are redeemed by God, who are seeking to be on a better path and live that way. My parents have lived that way most of their life. They're in their 70s now. God bless them. Life is not easy. This culture isn't easy, and it is getting worse. But I don't want people to be black-pilled. I want people to have hope. I talk about entertainment, and I'm fairly black-pilled on that, but even that can turn around. It's just a reflection of where our culture is at. I think our culture will heal in time, but people who have good traditional values and who genuinely care about other people, those are going to be the people who lead the charge to genuine healing in this country. I think that's who God is going to use in this country. Maybe one day I'll be a part of that, but I don't want to be prideful and say, "Oh, look at me, I'm a righteous individual," because I've got my own problems. But I do know what the Bible says, and I do try to live according to that. And I do try to give people grace and love people to the best of my abilities. It's really not easy, but I make a conscious effort to do that because it's the best way I know to live. My parents didn't just tell me to live that way, they lived it that way themselves. They weren't hypocritical about it. People who walk away, they see only hypocrisy. What you need is an example of people who are living out what they are preaching. And that's what my parents did. And that's what people in my life have done. So that's my thoughts on the cultural decline of America. Let me know what you think. Where do you think we're heading? How do you think we'll get out of things? What do you think it will take for things to turn around? Let me know in the comments below. This has been Super Koopa with another Koopa Talks. I will see you guys next time. God bless. Have a good one. Peace.